Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free wire tutorial today, we're going to make the Diamond Flower Pendant. Now it really doesn't take very many beads and it takes about 12 inches of that wire. So let's head down to the board and take a closer look at today's project. So I have a handful of beads ready to work with, and I'm going to be using some 1mm or 18 gauge wire to create this diamond flower pendant. I've just put my beads up to the side there, and there's the project that will work together. Now the tool I'm going to be using to achieve today's project is the multi-step bail maker. This has got 6 different sizes on one tool, which is really handy. Let's have a look at the wire. So I'm going to be demonstrating with a 12-inch length of 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I'm just going to make sure that that is nice and warm and smooth and ready to go. So just give that a couple of passes between thumb and forefinger and you'll notice the change immediately. So we are going to start off with number 4 on that bail making plier, and we're also going to be using number 2. Now obviously you can mix and match the sizes that you use, but I really like number 4 and number 2 for this project. So we'll start off with number 4 and we're going to make a basic kind of pear drop shape, and I'm just going to rotate that around until I get the remainder of the wire to kind of meet that start point. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit of a gap. I'm then going to be using my bent chain nose pliers, and if I hold that underneath, what we're going to do is to push that wire back so that it travels away next to that last little piece of wire that you worked with. Now there's a really big gap down at the bottom at the moment, so we want that to be as flat, as close together as you can possibly make it, but not so that it's crushed, because if you crush it, it will be slightly weaker. So I'm just going to open this out ever so slightly, which will give me an opportunity to grip over that little hairpin shaped bend that we have here, and I'm just going to close that up slowly. Now sometimes, dependent on the wire that you're working with or the tools or your experience with handling wire, you may find that that hairpin just flips over to the side. So to prevent that, I'm going to bring in a second pair of pliers. So this is a standard tapered chain nose set of pliers. Just hitting the desk, let's just move that up slightly. And what we're going to do is to grip across that form and then just firmly but slowly bring that so that it's slightly tighter. Now I am leaving a bit of a gap in there. I don't want it to be completely flat. We don't want it to be weakened, but we do want that to kind of come back on itself really neatly. So without further ado, let's grab those bail makers in again, and this time I'm going to use the number 2 on those bail making pliers. So showing you on the camera without hitting the lighting array is always good fun, but what we're going to do is to make a loop using that smaller segment on the bail makers, around about half the size of that first loop shape that we've made. Let's just bring that down. That might be slightly larger than I anticipated. If it's too big, you can pop those bail makers back in, draw the wire slightly open, rotate around, and you'll make that ever so slightly smaller. So what we're going to do is to move steadily around, using this starting point as the central aperture for the design. So I'm going to grip again across that tail of wire coming just before the last little bend that we created. Push that wire away again. And if it's a little bit too close to the centre, you can move that up slightly by popping your chain nose pliers across that angle and just pushing until that sits a little bit further away. I don't think that's quite enough, so I'm going to go again, and up it goes. Once I've got that sitting where I want it to, I'm going to again very gently just close up that loop in the centre so that we have a large loop on the outside and a smaller little hairpin shape on the inside. So I'm going to do one petal shape with number 4 on my bail makers, followed by 1 with number 2, and then we're going to do all the way around in that same fashion. So let's add number 4 back in. That was almost number 3. And rotate that wire around. It'll be much easier for you if you don't have to avoid cameras and things. Gently rotate that until it's about the same size as the first one. So what we're looking for is to reflect that size and shape. Let's just flatten that down for a second. That looks reasonable to me. If I just rotate that in the light, you'll see that it's looking relatively similar to that first one. So we're just going to continue to move around until we have 4 large and 4 small, as you can see here in this little shape that we created to begin with. So I'm just going to show you one more time. You're gripping across that wire. Let's just push that away. It's a little bit shorter now. Hopefully it won't catch on anything. Push that away so that the little hairpin sits around this central section. Now, once you have got all of your 8 loops or your 8 petal shapes, you can take your time to just refine these angles. Do close them up as you move around, because otherwise it's kind of tricky to get back in there to do that later. So each time you make a petal, close up that little hairpin. You can bring it in slightly together to make your life easier judging sizes and things. And then you will continue with 1 large, 1 small, 1 large, 1 small, until you have 4 of each, or 8 petals in total. I'll continue around that section and I'll be back with you in just a moment. So I've taken my time to create the little diamond flower shape. And I'm going to show you now how we can secure those 2 ends together and turn this into a beaded pendant. So here is the diamond flower shape. We've got the 4 large points or petals, and then we've got 4 of the slightly smaller ones, with each of those inner little hairpin sections pushed together but not completely closed up, in a vaguely circular form in the middle there. On the rear side here, I've just got the tail of the wire coming away. And what we're going to do for just a second is just bend this out of the way slightly. And I'm going to grip that approximately where I would be creating that next little hairpin shape. See if I can do this from underneath. And I'm just going to push that away for a moment. We can refine that later, and I'm pulling it away from the design because the next thing that I want to do is to add a bead in the centre here, and I think we'll use this shimmery shiny one from my stash. We're going to be using basically now a scrap length of wire. This is 0.4mm 26 gauge. It's around about 5 or 6 inches, and what we're going to do is take a look at where that end tail is. That needs to be up at the top, so I'm going to designate this petal as my top petal, which will head away towards that bail in a moment. And what I need to do is to find an access point. Let me just flip this over. On the opposite petal, so the lowest at the 6 o'clock position. And what I'm going to do here is just feed that wire through that lowest petal, hit the camera, obviously, and then I'm going to wrap that around a couple of times. Now you can take it all the way down to the bottom of that petal if you want to, as long as you get 3 or 4 really good tight wraps. Now at the moment those wraps are really loose and open, but what you can do is just scooch them up as close as you can get to that centre point. Now this is why we didn't want to crush those racetrack bits completely flat, because what we're going to do, let me just cut that residue away. Pop it in the scrap pot, make that end tidy. I think I've got about 5 wraps there, but like I say, you could use a longer piece of wire and take it all the way down to the base if you wanted to. Make sure that those wraps are nice and tidy, and then push them all the way up to that centre point. So just opening out that little hairpin section is plenty to allow that to sit smoothly. What I'm looking for is to have the wire on the front of the design. So I'm just going to make a gap, pull that through and flip it back over to the front of the design so that we can see what we're doing. So I've got my tail of wire just like so, and I'm going to add on my chosen centerpiece bead. It was a teardrop shape, bright fuchsia metallic there, and I'm just going to use a silver colour metallic faceted round glass bead. Push that down into the centre. So you do need to have a bead that kind of fits. It can stand a little bit proud at the front there. And the next thing we're going to do is to find a gap in the petal design and push that wire back through to the rear side of the design again. So we're back on the rear side of the design now, and I'm going to just wrap a couple of times around that central section of wire that will turn into our bail. I'm going to give that 3 or 4 wraps just to get a good strong seat for that bead on the front. Tighten those wires up. And then what we're going to do is use this tail of wire now to join together the beginning point where you've got that cut end, you can just see in the light there, and the end point that then turns into that elongated tail. So we need to now spend a moment just gently opening up each of those petals so that you can bring that end point and beginning point together side by side. So I'm just going to push that through because it's the easiest way to get everything to come together. Don't worry about this wire for the time being. What we need to do is to start by wrapping around the section of wire. In this case, it's the smaller petal, which has the wire coming away. So as long as we can get in there and go a couple of rotations with this short tail of 0.4. So I'm going to rotate, I think, twice around that attached wire. And then I'm going to add in the tail end, just where we started the whole design. So maybe I will go another couple of rotations, because what I don't want to happen is for this finer gauge wire to slide off the bottom of this open-ended petal. So we're going about a third of the way up the small petal. There we go, that looks good. So we've got a nice connection point, and then I'm going to start by wrapping whatever pattern you fancy. You could do a figure of 8. I'm just going to push the tail up inside the open-ended petal, the place where we started. And I'm going to do just a little couple of wraps around both of them before returning to just the smaller petal. So you'll see that this will draw those two pieces together. Let's go for one wrap, bring another wrap through. And like I said, you could go figure of 8 if you wanted to. And then I'm going to pull down sharply to tighten up that wrap before rotating a good 3 times around that closed up petal, the one that joins onto this elongated section coming away. So that's 1 wrap, 2, I'll do a 3rd wrap, and then I'll wrap twice around both of those petals again. Just push that down nice and neatly. If you don't want to push the leading edge through, you can take the tail and push it up and through. What we're doing is we're securing that petal form to create the diamond shape flower so that it doesn't come apart. So let's go for a 2nd wrap now around both of those petals before finishing off with 3 or 4 wraps up at the top here. So let's go 1, 2, 3, and the 4th wrap. Now before we cut the wire away, I'm going to make sure that's nice and neat and tidy. Trim the wire with the flush cutter so that the end sits inside the petal. Let's get that scrap away. And just tuck that away and hide it inside the design, like so. Once you're happy that those 2 petals are nicely joined together, protect your bead. We're still on the rear side of that pendant, and just give that little bit of weaving a tiny squish just to neaten it up and set it in position. Let's have a look at the front. That looks pretty good to me. So what we're going to do now is decide where we want that bail to come up. I had originally anticipated bringing it up here, but I actually quite like the idea of it coming up there now. You could, if you wanted to, wrap on both sides with the same technique. So 4 around one, the larger petal, and then 2 around both, whichever way you want to do it that makes you happy. I think what I'm going to do is to just bring the wire across the back slightly now, and then I'm going to use my plier just to bend that rear section of wire so that it sits behind one of those large petal shapes. That looks pretty decent to me. Now, remembering that we were using number 4 on those bail making pliers, I'm going to push that inside the form and draw the tail of wire over the top so that that now ghosts behind the petal form. Gripping just to the right of the centre, I'm going to push the wire upright and away. And what I think I will do is now copy what I've done here, which was a 4 and 2 wrap, and I'll just bring those 2 sections together. I might add a bit more wire over here. You can absolutely be fancy or you can absolutely be basic. The main reason I'm going to add a little bit more wire, and there's probably enough in that scrap that I just cut away, is because I want it to retain its shape I want it to be nice and secure, and at the moment that's not secure. So if I just draw that to the rear ever so slightly, I can give myself an access point. I'm going to wrap a couple of times around this piece, which is connected to the bail. I've got 4 rotations there, so I just need to make sure that that end is trimmed neatly and tidily. Didn't make it to the scrap pot, I'll pick that up later. Tidy up your wraps to make sure everything is good and neat. And then slide that down to the centre of the pendant. And then just draw those 2 wires together, so the outside of the larger petal and that rear section. So let's have a look. Draw the tail up through the petal and then push that back down towards the centre. And then what we're going to do is go for 4 wraps around the 2 large petal shapes, securing them together. So that's 1 and 2, 3 and 4. We need to make sure that those are nice and neat and tidy. Push them down to the centre of your pendant. And then I'm going to wrap around both those 2 large petal forms and the little one next to it. And I'll wrap around those twice. Keep those 2 large petal forms stacked one on top of the other. And we're just going to get a double wrap here. So again, you might wish to play around with the shape just to make sure that you're entirely delighted with how neat it is. Push that down through so you've got that double wrap. And then I'm going to finish off by wrapping around just the larger petal a couple of times. So ideally, there will be enough for 4 wraps to reflect the pattern that I chose to use earlier on. But if not, I can always take this off and add a slightly longer piece of wire. Just being thrifty today, to be quite honest. I burned through an awful lot of wire and it isn't cheap. So let's tuck that tail up and inside, give it a squish and a squeeze. And that's now fairly secure. So you, as I say, you will want to spend a little bit more time than I have just making sure that everything is nice and neat and tidy. Definitely use a longer piece of wire just here, probably another 5 or 6 inches, and then you can take that pattern all the way up to the top, keeping that second ghost petal underneath until you reach up to the top. So I wasn't enormously happy with that last little bit of wrapping, so I've just done it with a slightly longer piece of wire. I'll show you that on the board in just a tick, just to make it look a little tiny bit neater. Let's head down to the board and we'll complete our diamond flower pendant now. So you can see that's just a little bit neater now, and I have double strengthened that connection point between the main flower and that wire that comes up to become the bail. Speaking of bails, let's add some beads to add a little bit more drama to that neckline section. So I've got some faceted rondelles and a gorgeous clay bead from my pals at Jessie James Beads, and I'm going to add in a couple of those up at the top. You'll soon see whether or not you need to just sort of straighten that diamond flower underneath that bail up at the top. So let's put a little forwards bend in that wire, leaving myself a tiny little gap up there to wrap around. And I think I'll use step number 4 on those bail makers again. Definitely well worth a purchase if you don't have them yet. They are used very, very frequently in my workbench space. So let's make that round form nice and strong and get that wire wrapping around the core at least 1.5 times. I reckon we can get another wrap in there. Let's see. Yep, that's fit really nicely. Close that up and tighten your spirals. Make everything nice and neat and tidy. I'm going to bring that wire across the front. Give that a teeny tiny squish, being mindful of that bead, and then I'm going to make sure that the end is flush cut before adding a little spiral. You don't have to put spirals on everything, but I really like them, so let's use the smallest number 1 pin on those bail making pliers to create a round form, and then we're going to use our bent chain nose pliers just to push that into a little spiral. You can obviously take a little bit more time to make that much neater, as you prefer, or you can take that wire to the rear of the design and just trim it away and tuck it into the gap. So there's that spiral sticking away. I'm just going to tilt that back against that bail up at the top. And then you get that lovely little effect. Another thing that you can do is leave that without a bead. Just tie the end sections together before bringing that wire up at the back around just behind that large 12 o'clock petal. So you've got lots of choices in how you can use the diamond flower pendant. You don't have to bead it, but you do need to make sure that you tie the beginning and end together. I hope that you have enjoyed today's tutorial. I know that I have. I like making little forms like this out of wire. Enjoy the rest of your day today, and I hope to see you back here on the Gemhawks channel very, very soon. Bye for now.